friends, dear colleagues, and dear public online on Zoom. Welcome to today's lecture, History in the Edge, Zgodovina na Špici. I have a pleasure to introduce our guest today. Our guest is Ondřej Holub, which is also a pleasure for us, visiting fellow for this month at our institute. And I will proceed slowly with the short biography, and then I will give the word to our lecture. Ondřej Holub currently holds the position of a junior researcher at the Institute of Contemporary History in Prague, where he is conducting his research in the Department of the Analysis of Knowledge, Culture, and Expertise. His interests target mainly the transnational intellectual history of the European left, the history of socialist thought, and the history of the idea of socialism. He now focuses mostly on the topic of the Czech National Socialism and its origin and development in transnational and global context. But his previous work also dedicated to the origin and role of the reform communist movement in the area of Central Europe, or to the phenomena of left Catholicism in Austria and Czechoslovakia. During this 1 month stay at our institution, he intends to explore the local archival funds and library sources to define the role of Czech National Socialists in organizing the Slovenian National Socialist movement prior to the Great War, as well as transnational and intellectual connection between the Czech National Socialist Party and the Slovene National Socialist Party during the early 20s, which is a very interesting topic, has been already addressed in Slovenian historiography, but not dealt as deep as it should be. And the title of the lecture is Unified in a Cause on Connectioned History of Czech and Slovenian National Socialism. Dear Ondřej,
okay.
The floor is yours.
Thank you, Marco, for the very warm introduction, and thank you all of you for joining us in what would be a great debate about National Socialism, the topic of National Socialism, from the entangled transnational Czech and Slovene perspective. Before we dive in this great discussion, I would like to stress once again the very friendly welcome I have received here, alongside the most supportive background from all of you, and I really appreciate what guys you are doing for the developing the international community of scholars. So my today's lecture is conceived rather as a brief introduction to the intellectual and political history of Czech National Socialism, as I believe many of you probably never heard about it. But as the title of our session says, we will also approach the case of mutual relation between Czech and Slovene National Socialists and the whole issue of the transfer of ideas between two nations. So don't be afraid, I promise we will get there soon. We may start just with a little reflection on the theme. Dealing with National Socialism might be a challenging task, and the topic itself could be even slippery or paradoxical in a way. The reason for that is quite obvious. I think we all can, at least more or less, agree on one matter. When people are discussing National Socialism, in most cases, they probably mean this. That implicates that whenever National Socialism is delineated as a topic of discussion, then usually a whole series of similar images just come to our mind, almost instantly even, as something inherently connected to our politics, historiography, and public memory. In a way, I would say that general concept of National Socialism is still trapped in what we might call a loop of Hitlerism. This pervasive and ever-coming notion of National Socialist doctrine as merely a totalitarian consequence of a social Darwinist philosophy, public violence, and militarist policy of a German state in 1930s and 1940s. However, National Socialism in its essence more resembles a paradigm, a spiritual foundation that gives rise to particular discourses of the conjunction of national and socialist patterns of thought in an effort to achieve a distinctive emancipatory horizon of its own quality. In this respect, we encounter various different forms of National Socialism across time and space, such as, for instance, Palmiro Togliatti's conception of the Italian road to socialism. You can see Palmiro Togliatti right behind my back. The Austro-Marxist proposition of the Volksrepublik, the People's Republic, in the 1920s. That would be the middle picture. And of course, we have a very familiar example of Titoism, even as a confederated and multidimensional branch of National Socialism that even strived for a new type of transnational Yugoslav identity in a socialist sense. The situation is all the more complex because we are quite often simultaneously confronted with different types and phases of National Socialism at one time. The movement that we now recognize as a distinctive type of Czech National Socialism has its roots back in 1870s. Already in January 1872, Czech poet, writer, and activist Josef Barák, man here, published the first issue of a journal, the Workers' paper, Dělnické listy in Czech, where he, among other things, stated, "The Czech worker is first and foremost a Czech." At the height of what Eric Hobsbawm termed as Age of Capital, Barák, who as a political figure represented a sort of plebeian romantic radicalism, aimed to join the nationalist and socialist cause and lay down a foundation for a mass political movement, but ultimately he failed. The political and social stratification of Czech lands didn't so far allow the genuine development of a political movement or even a party of such a character in that time. The situation nevertheless rapidly shifted in the 1890s. In this period of a first globalization, as Jürgen Osterhammer has put it, and the advance of imperialism, the world entered a stage of radical mass politics, marked by a rise of progressive populism worldwide. The growing rate of literacy and consequent development of media culture fostered the political pluralism and further promoted a radical appeal to solve the social and economic burdens of industrial revolution. The middle-class elitism of the era has possessed a radical and populist dimension and embraced the idea of national progressivism or even national socialism, as we demonstrate on such examples as is the rise of so-called Narodníky movement in Russia, the establishment of Fabian society in Great Britain, or the activization of a significant progressive movement in America, in the United States. We also have many local but still significant cases, notably regarding our topic, the foundation of National Social Association in Germany and many other cases. The origin of Czech National Socialist Party as a particular movement does need to be seen as a one link in this chain of global transformations of public space and politics in the 1890s. The party was founded during a series of gatherings and meetings in spring of 1897 in Prague, and from the very outset of its existence, it was led by a group of radicals who previously belonged to the camp of national progressive liberals, but in face-to-face to growing importance or significance of Marxism, they reconsidered their positions and launched their National Socialist project as a new kind of progressive and national populism with both a radical and social liberal features. Václav Klofáč, the man behind me, a journalist and political activist who held a position of the chairman of the party since 1899 to the late 1930s, when he retired for almost all period of the interwar existence of the party. In fact, he has quite a unique position within the party ranks, since during the entire period of his leadership, he possessed a kind of charismatic authority that itself is need to be perceived in a way as a legacy of cultural romanticism of the 19th century and its notion of a tragic, romantic hero, a figure which disposed even some extraordinary moral qualities. Very often, Klofac was addressed as a spiritual father and a pioneer of national and Slavic socialism. Edvard Beneš, on the right, who may be familiar to you as an architect of a Little Entente and the second president of interwar Czechoslovakia, was a vice chairman of the party since the mid-1920s. He joined the party ranks in 1923, while his brother was social democrat, but he decided to switch a position and join the National Socialist. Thus, Edvard Beneš was a key figure who represented a distinctive social, liberal and progressive, let's say, less nationalistic approach that prevailed in the beginning of the 1930s and allowed the party to distinguish from the German Nazi movement that was really significant in the period of the early 1930s. And the logo in the middle between them, that's the official logo of the party. You can see there a feather representing intellectuals and a hammer representing the Balkan clouds kind of mingled together. Just a couple remarks on a party ideology and its political thoughts. The whole political and intellectual climate of Czech National Socialism has centered upon the rather folkish idea of a common man as a symbolic or metaphorical representation of the inherent values and qualities of the people. The idea of the common man, as such, represented a mode of subjectivity that spanned beyond the class notion of proletariat and proposed an alliance between lower middle class and working class. This is actually represented in a party logo, as we have seen, in this symbolic union of a feather and a hammer. Thus, the idea fostered the various populist agendas of the party and laid a foundation for the principle of progressive nationalism, a belief that Czech nation, as an organic community of common men, has its own democratic legacy and a consequent responsibility for the fate of democracy on national but also at transnational level. This very idea of progressive nationalism was not exclusively National Socialist. It also has played a crucial role in the political philosophy of Tomáš Garrigue Masaryk, for instance, and it has formed a philosophical basis for the interwar Czechoslovak republicanism, but for the National Socialists, that really was a background for further development of their political thought and such notions of social and women's rights, equality, solidarity, and others. This whole notion of women's rights particularly is really strongly present since Czech National Socialists perceived nation as one organic community that needs to gather its strength. So on this particular basis, they promoted women's rights quite strongly. While rooted in a particular reflection of historical legacy, the idea of progressive nationalism included distinctive features of anti-clericalism and anti-imperialism, and was very closely connected to the idea of so-called Slavic socialism. If you are now asking yourself what specifically this Slavic socialism was, then according to Klofac and other leaders of the party, Slavic socialism represented a current of ethical socialism that was quite contradictory to rationalist paradigm of Western socialism and was inspired mostly by works of Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, and this whole romantic idea of Slavic democratism. Of course, this is a very essentialist idea and a pan-Slavic in origin. The reference to Slavic socialism were somewhat present at the very beginning as the core idea of the party program, but intensified substantially after the annexation of Bosnia in 1908 and during the Balkan Wars, 1912-1913. Again, this is also inherently connected to the very core idea of the common man. Yeah. This is just to illustrate the electoral support of the party. National Socialists gained their strength predominantly among lower middle class voters and so-called petite bourgeoisie, namely in the ranks of what we might call urban intelligentsia, people like teachers, clerks, and so on. Significantly popular was the party among railway workers due to the strong trade unionist policy they have towards them, and also the members of Sokol organization supported the party quite generously because the idea of progressive nationalism resonated in their ranks quite substantially. Just to give you some insight into the actual strength of the party in the interwar era, it usually gained among 8 to 10% of votes in a national election and was among the 5 strongest parties in Czechoslovakia. Now, this is what brings us to the issue of mutual relations of Czech and Slovene National Socialists. While we are dealing with the issue, it is worth recognizing that the national communities of Czechs and Slovenes belong to the family of Western Slavic nations, and as such, they shared their political and cultural aspirations and goals, at least from the so-called Spring of Nation in 1848. Similar social and political patterns, as well as the comparable level of the cultural development, only strengthened the mutual ties and transfer of concepts and ideas. In this regard, Pan-Slavism, anti-clericalism, anti-imperialism, and the idea of Slavic socialism were exactly those labels that connected the similar political communities across the border and established a kind of synergy that was needed for the origin of Slovene National Socialist movement. These were the parts of chains that unified Czech and Slovene National Socialists in cause. It appears to me, though quite significantly, that from the very beginning the Slovene National Socialism, which initially originated as a trade unionist movement under the label Národná dělnická organizace in the city of Trieste, approximately between years 1907 and 1909, was merely a Czech transnational project and is to be perceived as an attempt of Czech National Socialists to foster the idea of Slavic socialism and establish a form of international movement as an organizational basis for its development. Also, Národná dělnická organizace, the NDO, was founded in purpose to help local Slovenians in Trieste to tackle the continually growing influence of the Italian Social Democratic Party and also the growing influence of local Germans. So the motive of the Pan-Slavic idea was also clearly present. Again, note that the origin of Slovene National Socialism could be traced back to the time around annexation of Bosnia and the outbreak of Balkan Wars. Here I would like to quote some words that Karel Pulpan, a leader of a Czech National Socialist youth, addressed to Slovene National Socialists at 1911 on occasion of the first published issue of the review Národní socialist, which you can see on the screen. So the words of Karel Pulpan. Our movement, that means National Socialist, means the outset of Slavic socialism. So Slavic socialism appears here again. Slavic socialism, which must find its path from Prague and Ljubljana for the south among the workers of Croatia and the workers of other Slavic nations. And here in Prague, we strongly believe that you, our Slovenian brothers, will become the apostles of National Socialism in the Slavic South. Be steadfast, be brave, be proud, be just, good Slovenian socialist. So these are the words of Karel Pulpan that illustrate vividly the visions and aspirations that Czech National Socialists put into the origin of the Slovene movement. Quite many young Czech national socialists participated in organizing the national socialist communities and party cells associated in Národná dělnická organizace, a trade unionist organization, not only in Trieste, but also here in Ljubljana. Among them, people like Kamil Černý, Karel Pulpán, Emil Špatný, and other people who probably you don't know. All these young guys that were very active in the anti-militarist and anti-imperialist agenda. However, they were swiftly joined by local sympathizers, as for example is Slavoj Šker. It is Šker or
Šker.
Okay. Who worked as a bank officer here, a clerk in a local bank in Ljubljana. And Ignat Siard, unfortunately I don't have a picture of him, but he was a bookbinder from Ljubljana also. Šker was also quite active in local liberal and anti-clerical circles. And there are some indications, at least some research indicates that he might be a chief editor of a satirical journal Pika, which was published between 1912 and 1913 and was very strictly anti-clerical and provoked bourgeois moral standards at the time by publishing even some erotic jokes and so on. So this apparently little bored gentleman you can see on the screen is Slavoj Šker, the representative of Slovene National Socialism in Ljubljana. The small trade unionist and political organization whose leadership and membership consisted both of local Czechs and Slovenes had a rather big ambitions. It strived to fill the gap between Catholic and Marxist ideological camps and create an alternative political force that would stand for a majority of Slovenes. They even claim that only like 10% of people are interested in politics. So in the first issue of Národní socialist, they set a goal to like achieve to majority of 90% Slovenians and represent them on the national level. But before the Great War, the movement never raised to such a level of significance in a matter of influence and membership that would be sufficient for establishment of the independent political party. Actually, when you read Národní socialist newspaper, you quickly realize that there are an original articles or short essay, mostly from Slavoj Šker or some others, but otherwise the content mostly consisted of reprinted materials from Czech National Socialist newspapers. Before the war, the movement may have had a few hundred supporters, 1,000 maybe. It's hard to say exactly, although some reports at Národní socialist about local meetings indicated a number of participants that varied from 60 to 100 or even 300 in one case. But that applies only to Ljubljana. I don't know yet the exact numbers for the surrounding regions and other towns. Slovenian National Socialists nevertheless succeeded in gaining political support among railway workers. So we can see a social pattern here that is like kind of transferred from the Czech National Socialist Party to the Slovenia, and established a trade unionist organization such was the Union of the South Slavic Railway Workers. The original name was like Zväz jugoslovanských železničářů. It is notable that in a case of Czech National Socialism, it was not just a political idea that what has been transferred, but also, as I said, socio-political patterns. As is obvious, then in both countries, the party gained support from the same social strata, the same social groups, the railway workers, clerks, teachers, urban intelligentsia. The situation have changed briefly after the war, when a political climate within the country for the diversified. The internal contradictions and dissolution in the liberal camp has led to a creation of a National Socialist Party, Národná sociální stránka, in December 1919. It was due to the dissolution from the Jugoslavská demokratská stránka. Again, the influence of the Czech National Socialist Party here was quite significant, as there were very tight connection between both parties, and also Václav Klofáč maintained a strong personal relation to the Slovenian brothers. Ivan Deržič, who was previously active as a chairman of a Zväz jugoslovanských železničárev, became a chairman of the party, and in 1920 parliamentary election he has been elected deputy. In parliament he waged a fight for a series of progressive issues, as most notably the universal suffrage for women and women's rights as such, but it did come in vain back in those times. I believe the universal women's suffrage was passed as a law in 1945. Yeah. So these are some notable figures. The Národná sociálna stránka kind of draw people like Franz Skidrich or Ivan Priatel, who stood very close to the party, although I don't know exactly whether they were like ordinary party members. But historian Yuri Perovšek indicated that he stood quite close. So I'm just quoting him right now. As you can see, despite its ambitions, the party was rather unsuccessful. It only gained about 6,000 votes in 1920 Constitutional Assembly election, which resulted in having 2 seats in parliament, one for Ivan Deržič and one for Anton Brandner from Maribor. Brandner was also very active in National Socialist trade unions in Trieste before the Great War. Already in 1923, nevertheless, the party lost about 1/3 of votes and also his representation in parliament. This political crisis ultimately led to the dissolution of National Socialists and their integration to a bigger and more significant independent democratic party, or Samostojná demokratská stránka, which was a social liberal and let's say I think center-left subject in the Yugoslav political universe. The reason why the party failed, it's a very complex task and it's not easy to address the issue. Probably the party just didn't fit into already established schemes of Slovene and Yugoslav politics. Again, if the National Socialism is a paradigm that gives a rise to many doctrines, perhaps there were other forces in contemporary kingdom of Serbs, Croats and Slovenes that represents this paradigm much better, perhaps. Perhaps some progressive liberal figures such Ivan Tavčar, Ivan Hribar and or others. Maybe we can conceive that the whole issue of Slovene National Socialism merely as cultural import that just failed in a context where antagonistic forces of Christian democracy, liberal progressivism and Marxism have already held their positions. But that's a matter of discussion, and I would like to thank you now and open a floor for questions.
Thank you very much for dear Ondřej, for this kind of introduction, especially this fascinating to this. Those are?
No, Edvard Beneš with his wife, Hanna.
I thought so, but still.
This is the colorized picture from 1933. 2 years prior, he was elected a president. He was a minister of foreign affairs back then.
As much as I, maybe just a couple of comments for the beginning. I think it was very interesting how someone from outside Slovenian historiography frames that, and which is great. It gives us another perspective, because usually in the Slovenian historiography, especially since the 1990s, it was the basic idea who supported the autonomous position of Slovenian nation or Slovenian unit or Slovenians, and who supported basically the unitarian position in Yugoslavia. And of course, this party shifted a little bit and started as a very pretty much autonomous. That's why those people, as those intellectuals who were very well known to support Slovenian individuality, were supporting it, and so then they slowly shifted towards, and they merged back to this liberal current, the classical Slovenian liberals who supported unitarism.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, like before the 1914, the members of this Národná dělská organizácia really strongly supported the idea of the Slovene autonomy and independence, namely in the Trieste region. But after the war, the party kind of proposed and held this idea of unitarism, the Yugoslav identity. So that's a shift. Thank you.
That's a shift, and it also in the 20s there were some shift in some how they positions themselves, and of course if you take a look at it, it's not always either or. There's some kind of sometimes also the middle ground and some let's say ambivalent position on this topic, and maybe since you mentioned it, maybe it was not so important. It was maybe so important that we in Slovenian historiography always concentrate only on the issue of autonomy or unitarism, but other currents and other trajectories and other traditions were also important. This Czech version of National Socialism was definitely one of the traditions that was around, and it had certain ground even before the war. Although I must admit, as I used to do a lot of work on pre-war, on 19th century, early 20th century, but this Šker figure is pretty much, let's say, marginal figure in Slovenian history, much more than later National Socialist of Slovenia. So yeah, and are there any questions right now, or I will take the first question? I will take the first.
Okay.
I'll make the first question. It's about this emphasis of progressivism. I don't even can
Yeah, I
pronounce.
conceive it as a national progressivism.
Could you explain a little bit more, because I find it very interesting, and usually it's not the Central European history, especially in the early 20th century history, is not seen through the perspective of this current, let's say, this perspective, but it had certain influence. So could you a little bit elaborate more on that?
I think the whole idea is kind of rooted in this streams of cultural romanticism in the 19th century period, but it was at least partially summarized by Tomáš Garrigue Masaryk in his 1895 book Česká otázka, the Czech question, where he kind of delineated what would be it was called in smysl českých dějin, the essence of the Czech history or its foundation. Masaryk reacted to the current discussions about the position of Czech nation in Central Europe and Europe as such, and he kind of proposed a national program for Czechs, while he argued that the legacy of the Protestant Reformation of the 15th and 16th century set a foundation for the origin of a democracy, and so consequently it is a task of a Czech nation as an organic community to foster the idea of democratization in this line of tradition of the Protestant movement. So it sparked a huge discussion. Of course, a Catholic camp opposed the very idea that Masaryk proposed, but it very strongly resonated, like within the progressive circles, in not only in Prague but in Czech lands, in the whole Czech lands. And after 1918, it sort of became the foundational idea of Czechoslovakia, and it kind of mingled this idea of national progressivism, kind of mingled with this idea of Slavic socialism. So I think both Masaryk and Beneš fostered the idea that in some respect, Czechs are sharing this democratic legacy with other Slavic nations, especially with some such Western Slavic nations as Slovenes. So, and therefore they strive to make a foundation for the international political alliance, such was Little Entente, for example. So the whole idea of national progressivism was like behind it. It was really a like intellectual center for the progressive Czech politics and liberal Czech politics since the late 1890s to the interwar era.
Thank you. Question, please.
Nobody is interested in.
No, I mean, I kind of have questions, but I don't know if they make sense or if they are. I will be able to kind of elaborate nicely. But I wanted to ask maybe more generally, what would you say that this case study could kind of tell us more broadly about Czech-Slovenian entanglements in political thought in this period, and maybe. How do you see that this, what you showed now, fits into broader kind of influence of Masarykian thought in Slovenian and Yugoslav lands in this period? I don't know if you already kind of researched that a bit more, but if I understood correctly, your focus here was more on the party and the people who were active in the party, but it might be useful to look more broadly at other kind of streams of thought that maybe did not translate into the creation of a party, National Socialist Party, but something else, like, I don't know. I mean, one example could be of Masarykian influence in Slovenia is the political thought of Alojzija Šteblja and her activism in the 1920s, who was before the war social democrat, but then after the war was the leader of the feminist movement. And she had a somehow...
Anton Dermota, yeah. I have read his book, Slovenský politični problém.
So I'm just wondering if maybe you can add a bit more about that, if you have any further thoughts.
I think this research I presented here briefly is only one chain in a like differentiated and a complex structure. What like right now I'm mostly interested in a transfer of ideas between Czech and Slovene communities of intellectuals and political leaders, let's say. So in the next period, like for the next few weeks and months, I suppose my research will span beyond this kind of narrowed notion of a political party to reach the general idea of a progressive movement as differentiated cultural and political streams that sort of connected the Czech and Slovenes on a transnational level. And I really feel that current historiography is somehow missing some important parts of our mutual history and our mutual stories, because I really think that as much as these communities were rather insignificant on a political level, they never really gained so much, votes. They were significant in a matter of like transporting such universal values and notions of human rights across the border, and they sort of established like transnational progressive community. And Slovene and Czech National Socialism was a part of these transnational progressive communities. So
this sounds fascinating because it shows a little bit. It reframes our position, because usually we just read in our national history about those people. And of course, even in Slovenian national historiography, this kind of Czech influence is emphasized, always has been, and a post-Masaryk tradition also, but usually more with a connection with the then Social Democratic Party, because especially before the First War, most of those people entered to enter the Social Democratic Party, but then some of them
I mean, I'm kind of fascinated about the whole issue that progressive values, as we may term it, were at some point universal values. For instance, the question of women's suffrage and women's rights, they were like shared transnationally. Of course, they were always like centers of the progressive movement, like the American cities of Boston and Chicago, maybe London, Paris, and so all, you know, the great capitals. But so the values as such were universal, but the way how these ideas circulated were kind of embedded in the local conditions, and I think we now might recognize more the whole background of these transfer of ideas between national communities.
It's also something connects with that. It's my idea, because I can see this. And on the one hand, this National Socialists, also in Slovenia and here, were very much bound to this kind of organic view of national community. It's pan-Slavism, common man, and this kind of idea of this democratic nature of a Slavic person, of Slavic peoples, that also resonated in another part of the political spectrum in mid-war period. But on the other hand, progressivism, it's, as you said, it's bound to those really transnational general ideas of human rights, women rights.
Exactly. Yeah.
So how does this combine? Because this idea of, on the one hand, it sounds to me as it'd be some kind of merging of the two terms saying of Gesellschaft and Gemeinschaft, in a way, trying to be two in one. So is this also this kind of problem that it's only bound to the Central Europe, or it's the progressives in other parts of the world also address also the more organic way of approaching the masses?
Yeah, that's really something debatable, and
I know it's the most general question that it can be, but I was just thinking about that.
For sure, that's a matter of ongoing research. I think I need to confront the issue like more broadly. Certainly, I think the question of yours is also a part, maybe, why the National Socialism in a Slovenian climate have failed, because this social basis for urban intelligentsia and for the lower middle class strata was kind of much more generous in the Czech lands than in Slovenia. Maybe, you know, the whole Slovenian national community as such was much smaller than a Czech one, and I think this community was also not so stratificated as in the Czech case. So while we have here in Ljubljana and Slovenia, let's say, the national progressive camp, liberal progressive camp represented by people as Ivan Tavčar, for example, and on the other hand we have a Marxist camp and a clerical camp represented by Janez Evangelist Grek, very like a foundational figure. Then the space for establishing a new party was kind of really narrowed down, and that's a reason why I think this whole project came in vain, at least partially.
I think it's one of the important aspects. I have one question online. Jana Javornik has a comment and question, and I will now read it. Thanks muchly for the presentation, so timely and relevant, particularly the often neglected Czechoslovenian comparison. I am particularly boggled with your characterization of progressive populism. Why I appreciate this, and by your logic, it does sound rather oxymoronic to my social science mind, especially given the current trends. Given the rise of non-progressive populism, what lessons could we possibly draw from the past to inform the contemporary developments in both countries today, please?
Okay, I will try to address this.
It's a really question. Thank you, Jana, for this question. It sounds really someone who no historian could ever pose a question like that, but only some profound social scientist, I suppose. It's true.
It's always question, and it's sort of ever coming, how to properly address the National Socialism in a Czech case, and how to distinct, let's say, Czech National Socialism from the German National Socialism and from other currents of National Socialism. Of course, Czech National Socialists themselves depicted themselves as a standard bearers of Slavic socialism, and the pioneers of the progressive idea of the human unity, and this idea of the common man, which really laid the foundation for their perception of democracy and socialism and other notions. But my approach to Czech National Socialism as a branch of populism is based on a theory of Ernesto Laclau, the Argentinian theoretician of populist movement. Because when I have read his book and remarks on populism, and he wrote quite many articles and books on this topic, I realized slightly that what he is describing, this whole condition for a rising of the populist movement, really suit to the origin and the whole context of foundation and development of National Socialist movement in a Czech context. You know, Laclau sort of defined the populist moment, which is the moment of the outbreak, when the level of frustration within the national and political community reached the point where the national community feel that their aspirations and goals couldn't be fulfilled in a current context, and they are trying to find something new, some new political forms. And this is when the populist moment, as Ernesto Laclau is depicting, is is entering the stage and give a rise for a new type of political movement. Such, for instance, was Czech National Socialism in the 1890s. I think for the Czechs, and maybe for the Slovenes also, I'm not really sure about that, the late 1890s was really a populist moment. So this is why populism. It's based on Ernesto Laclau theory and some other theories of populism.
And of course, now to repeat the question, the last part of the question: what lessons could we possibly draw from the past to inform? That's why. Does this sound a little bit in today's, which we associate populism mostly with right-wing populists?
Yeah, and that's I think
that
that's
are really pretty much, let's say, going towards something that I don't know, Umberto Eco would say ur-fascism, and here we have something completely different. How different it is, and I'm not surprised as someone when hears the word populism and progressive populism and stuff like that it sounds a little bit odd in today's setting.
I think what we are facing today is a resurgence of the reactionary movement. You know, people like Trump, J.D. Vance, and others are sometimes labeled as fascist, which I think is quite incorrect, because I think the fascist movement is very closely related to the interwar era, and this like a military spirit and this tendency for the organic community. But these people of the super rich CEOs and corporate magnates, they really want to push society back even before French Revolution and to the early 19th century, when capitalism faced no regulations and then just flourished in a cost of a population. And I think under the influence of neoliberal hegemony of the 1990s, we somehow tend to believe that there are like two camps, like liberal one and the populist one, which are kind of like opposing and waging a war against each other and so on. And I feel we need to restore as historians and public intellectuals, we need to restore our story, our national stories, and we need to kind of differentiate these particular political currents, and we need to make some distinctions between them in order to understand the essence of the political collectivity and the essence of what brings people together in the name of some ideas. And I think the recognizing National Socialism as a radical and populist current, which also was not only progressive, but also, reactionary in some particular matters. For example, they were really, Czech National Socialists, they were really anti-Semitic. They were like very anti-German in a sense. So I think we need to reconstruct this whole idea of National Socialism in order to understand the collective identity of these political movements, in order to propose an alternative for the reactionary movement of current political right.
So you would say that maybe the term populist is more suitable for the National Socialists than for today's reactionary movements.
I think we need to embrace populism again, like to take it as our own. It's we have a right to be populist. It's nothing bad to be a populist. From the like sort of liberal elitist perspective, it is bad. But there is also like democratic populism, and social progressive populism. Bernie Sanders on that matter is a progressive populist, and it's right. It's a very, from my perspective, it's a political stance that might work and can like draw more attention of voters, and it really can be a foundation for the new political movement. I think what we lack now today in the face of the reactionary movement, which is gaining strength like globally, is the international organization similar to the Comintern, for example. It's not about that I am missing like international communism, but I think we need to have a progressive democratic force on the international basis that would be strong enough and organized enough to challenge and to tackle this really oppressive reactionary stream that is gaining strength today.
Is there another question after this detour to political present?
I have a slightly more boring history-related question.
That's great. Let's go back to that. That's where we belong.
Yeah, so on your slide about the programmatic aspects or like the typological aspects of National Socialism in the Czech context, it was mentioned that it was anti-Marxist. So it made me think, so what were their answers, for example, to the issues of the time, let's say the interwar period? Does this mean that, for example, they were looking towards more corporate solutions, for example, towards economic issues? Were they seeing like the development of fascist policy in Italy as a positive model or something else?
Your question basically concerns more like practical issues of their policy. That's also a complicated one because from let's say 1918 to 1923, the party also consists from different branches. Like they were like more nationalist branches, but they were also anarchists and left radicals who left party in the mid 1920s. The connection between anarchist movement and national socialist movement it's quite particular issue, but it was quite strong even before 1920s. And from the mid 1920s, I think there is a growing importance of social liberal policy. Especially at the beginning of 1930s, the party proposed a very coherent program, which is called Beneš program, as the Edvard Beneš is considered to be his like spiritual father. And the program is very social liberal. It's classical thing like higher taxation and funding the public sector and all the related issue that we may address as a social liberal in a sense. And I think as I noticed in a party program from the 1930s, I think that they really embraced the idea of a New Deal policy of the United States. Already in 1932, 1933, they proposed this idea of nationalization of the key industry and bank sector and so on. So that's also why after 1945, Czech National Socialists were a part of the National Front. Because they shared with other socialist parties this idea of nationalization, socialization of the public sector as a key principle for fostering the reforms.
So this kind of liberal kind of thought and practice was very much present, but social liberal. So they were more social liberals than liberal socialists. What would you say?
Definitely, yeah. But they were, in a matters of their language, they depicted themselves, of course, as a socialist. In a confrontation with Marxism, they even depicted themselves as a true socialist, because they have this argument that the true socialism could emanate only on a national basis, not on the international one. So they considered themselves to be socialist, of course, but from the perspective of time, we now may, I think, concluded that they were social progressive, social liberals. That was from my perspective, that was a social liberalism with a strong populist feature.
Thank you. Okay, any other questions? Or should we slowly proceed to the very important part of our lecture? After the debate, usually there's coffee and biscuits. So if everything is okay, then if there's no questions, thank you for these wonderful lectures, and I think I really enjoyed also the questions, and I enjoyed the debate also detour to political present. Why not? We are all not just historians, we're public intellectuals, so we need to think in those terms too. And thank you till maybe someone will help me, Nisa.
Yes.
The next lecture will be
on the 5th of February on probably right-wing extremism.
On the 5th of February about extremism. So thank you until now and have fun. Goodbye.
Thank you all. Thank you for your attendance.